So, hello everybody, we're going to take a look at what we in Tennesse Heartwood have dubbed the 3 R's of National Forest Management in the Eastern United States: forest restoration, resiliency, and regeneration. And this is a look region-wide at how these terms are being applied on the ground in forests ranging from the Shawnee to the Cherokee to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, all the way down into Georgia. So let's take a look at how these terms are being applied and how they are shaping for our forests and forest management overall. So the first thing that we want to do is we do want to make a little disclaimer here. These 3 terms, restoration, regeneration, and resiliency, do have legitimate applications in the overall field of ecology and then in various sub-disciplines. But however, what we're wanting to do here is seeing how specifically the United States Forest Services puts these terms to use and how these uses are affecting the health of the forest, the overall character of the landscape, the politics, and as an emerging issue, the public's right to participate in forest policy and have transparency from the agency on how our forests are being managed. So we need to really start off, first of all, with what our eastern forests are. Compared to the West, we have a wetter, more deciduous mosaic of forest and woodland, and even some open lands communities that are a mixture of the oaks and the hickories, various pines, everything, also other things from beeches to poplars, you name it. So that we have definitely a different type of forest than you see out west. However, the forests in the east reflect the settlement history since the 16 and 1700s. Much of the land in the eastern U.S. was cut over, turned into farmland, mining lands, you name it. And so pretty much unlike out west, where there were still lots of areas that still were sparsely populated and could be pretty much declared federal land without having been significantly logged, you have very little of that in the east. Most of our forests were purchased between about 1910 and 1940. A lot of it during the New Deal era and in the decades before that. And so it's what we call second growth. So it's a recovering forest, and you'll have some parts of the forest, particularly lands that were maybe have only been coming back up, say maybe 70, 80 years old, appear to be what is called an even age forest. And they're somewhat dense in character, reflecting a recovering landscape. And these forests are periodically logged because the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act says that there will be some commercial harvesting of timber on the landscape. So the agency, the Forest Service, says that it needs to transform the landscape that we have through the methods of regenerating those forests, restoring them to what they model as maybe having been a historical forest competition, or working towards making them, quote, resilient towards any type of human caused or natural caused stresses in the present or the near future. So the first R we're going to talk about is regeneration. So as we know, forests have the ability to regenerate themselves. They've been doing it for eons. But the agency says in the Eastern United States is that forests are not able to regenerate themselves in the composition that they find desirable, which is in many forests, a very oak and upland pine type of composition. The agency says that a lot of oak and mixed hardwood stands are in decline for a variety of reasons, and that they thus need to be logged to help promote advanced oak regeneration. Although the reasons why we may not have quite as much oak, at least in this blip of time, regeneration are quite complex and really worthy of a whole study to themselves that I wish we had time for, but we don't. But it is covered more in the more in-depth version of the presentation on our site. So when the agency wants to start logging these forests to for what are now ecological reasoning of forest regeneration, that means they need to start cutting some logging roads or blaze through previous logging roads. Unfortunately, the backlog of road maintenance on the National Forest System is such that for over 20 years, there's been a mandate to start decreasing the volume of roads. Why is this important? First of all, road maintenance is very expensive, and we have a serious shortfall budget-wise for this. Also, roads become vectors of erosion, of loss of water quality. They can block streams if they're not properly culverted, and they also become vectors of invasive species. And the spread of invasives in eastern forests is still, I think, a really underappreciated issue. We've had things like kudzu for over century, but the continued incursion of invasives like kudzu and stiltgrass into the forest interior is really being worsened by these persistent high road volumes. And you see this all over the East, particularly in the South, Tombigbee and Mississippi, or the Holly Springs in Mississippi, or the Cherokee, National Forest in Alabama, all over the place. The regeneration cuts also tend to be cuts that involve clear cutting, where all the trees in an area are taken out, or almost all of them. They leave a few. They'll call that like a seed tree or shelterwood cut, and this can bring a multiplicity of problems on their own. Look at this shot over in White Mountains National Forest. You can see erosion is probably starting to begin there. We see this also fragments the forest. That starts creating a lot of issues in terms of wildlife habitat. And then these regeneration cuts, even though the goal may say we want to make sure that, say, white oak and northern red oaks are regenerate properly, or maybe we want shortleaf pine to continue to regenerate. Well, we are finding in forest after forest, this really isn't happening a lot of the time. You go places like the Shawnee, where they have had oak regeneration cuts from the night all the way back in 1990s. They've had 25, 30 years for the agency to cut and then somehow promote the regeneration of oaks. And it's just not happening. And of course, the invasives are often coming in. So a lot of these places like Shawnee, or say the Pisgah, or the Daniel Boone, they'll say we're wanting regeneration oaks, and instead we'll come up with things like poplars and maples, which are species they don't consider to be as desirable. And it's gotten to the point where enough time has passed where some of these places that they cut, say in the 90s or early 2000s, failed in oak regeneration, and they're going back in and trying to restore the failed regeneration. We can see this in the Cherokee. We can see this in the Hoosier. We can see this all over the East. The second R that we're going to discuss is forest restoration. This is where it really starts becoming complex. And restoration has exploded as a concept in public lands management since the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003, which kind of did a couple of things. First is that it made the agency able to not have to say, well, we're just wanting to get the cut out. Now we could say that, well, we're logging for this benign practice of restoring the forest. And you would be hard pressed to find any substantial timber project in the East, and probably most of the United States in general, that isn't listed as a forest health and restoration project. And so we've been doing this all across the United States and in the East where we're focusing on that. We've had 2 and 3, getting close to 3 decades of these restoration logging projects. And like the regeneration cuts, the results are sometimes concerning, and in some places very concerning. You can go around the Pisgah, the Nantahala, the Cherokee, the Chattahoochee, all around the southern Appalachian forests, and these places where they have done various regeneration or restoration logging, and you have dense stands of poplar. So we're talking about a near monoculture in some of these stands. And definitely not what anybody wants. The agency, once again, is having to go back and quote restore places that they logged 2, 3 decades or further back, where the biodiversity went down. And we see projects that have done this that are 5, 8, 10 years old, and the problem is still it continues. One of the ways that the agency has addresses forest ecology and the idea of restoring forests is addressing the issue of wildland fire. And fire, like forest ecology in general, is a fairly new science, and the jury is still out on many aspects of it. We know that out west, many forest communities and open lands communities have a very strong fire association. The east, it's very complex because it's a much wetter place. And so the agency has a huge budget now nationwide for fire management, often to do what we call controlled burns. And unfortunately, although fire science is an important part of forest ecology, there's a concern that fire ecology winds up getting wrapped in once again with timber targets, and it becomes hard to separate real ecology and legit science from the mandate to simply get the cut out. We need to log this place because fire suppression has kept the forest from taking on the composition that it has, or that we do various types of loggings to mimic natural fire regimes. And so, whereas in the West, you may have many places where forest communities or woodland communities would often completely replace and regenerate with very strong fire. In the East, we have a different situation. Now, some places in the East, definitely have a fairly well-established fire association, like Black Belt prairie remnants that you'll see like in the Tom Bigby in Mississippi, or those Table Mountain pine forest communities that are like on really dry, craggy mountain sites in certain little spots in the southern Appalachians. But a lot of the East, fire becomes more complex, and the fire definitely did not have the frequency that you see out west. And we see this problem, though, is that because the agency is given a big fire budget, and the agency also is being told we need to find some, rationale to keep logging, we start having where we see where rangers will model what they say are historically heavily fire associated forest communities that we need to log and burn. And it's in some forests, it starts having where everything looks like a nail because you've been given this very strong hammer. We've seen places like in the Cherokee where they would have, like in this picture here, of a fairly moist beech maple forest, and then that would be part of an area that they wanted to log to turn into a dry pitch pine ridge site. Now, fortunately, when we talked to the agency on this particular project, they agreed to kind of drop that one. Yeah, maybe the modeling wasn't quite right on that one. Another example of this was in further south in the Cherokee, not far from the Ocoee River, a place called Tumbling Creek, where they were going to log a north-facing shady hemlock and beech forest community to create what they said would be a xeric dry shortleaf pine community. And this was on a site with extremely steep slopes, on soils that were heavily documented as being unsafe for logging. So this would not have been a very ecologically appropriate restoration project, either because that's probably not where you would see a lot of shortleaf pine, but also because some serious erosion would happen along that stream. Fortunately, that did not happen on that one. Unfortunately, we see so often these projects that have forest health and restoration or forest regeneration take place, and theory meets reality, and the results do not yield this mixed, diverse hardwood forest with desired oak or oak hickory or oak shortleaf pine communities. You see some places like this where you have serious erosion, or you see places like this in the Chattahoochee, where there was an attempt at restoring shortleaf, 20 years before, and I think they logged it and did some mechanical hacking to suppress maples and planted some shortleaf pine, and it just came up maples. Then there's the notorious Brawley Project. The Brawley Project was on the north end of the Chattahoochee. This has been going on, I think, 12, 13 years, something like that, where they basically logged several hundred acres, taking out most of the trees in some areas close to clear cuts, and that they modeled this forest was something like an oak woodland, where it was very open canopy and lots of grassy forbs, almost like a savanna in a way. And unfortunately, the results have not been particularly promising. They've logged it, they've burned it, they've hired people to go in and herbicide stump sprouts. And after over a decade, thousands and thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money and people power hours, and it just the success is elusive, and it begs us to ask: was it maybe not true that the area was a woodland, that's not normal in that place? When we see this type of stuff happening, it makes us want to think maybe the science in forest restoration is still so new and still not conclusive enough to where maybe handing over hundreds of acres at a time to do these projects might be a bit rash. The Cherokee National Forest, which is just to the north of the Chattahoochee, very similar management plan with similar goals, trying to promote advanced oak regeneration, restoring areas that had been logged decades before and had turned into poplar and maple stands, shortleaf pine restoration. But many of these projects just aren't working, and they've really been accumulating. And fortunately, we can say is that a ranger came a few years ago in the south part of the Cherokee who really was willing to take a look and say, what's been going on here? What's not working? And so they've done some reports and inventorying some of these projects that happened in, say, 2008 and 2010, and what actually happened. Was it successful? Did they get oaks? Did they get shortleaf? And many times it's not happening. And not only is it not happening, it's also having some serious implications in the long-term health of that land, as the Cherokee is a very mountainous place and often has very sensitive slopes and soils. And as a result, we have places where not only is the shortleaf or the oak and shortleaf not happening, we're seeing serious degradation of the land and the hydrology. This particular project called Hogback is kind of like Brawley. It's become kind of a legendary, unsuccessful project where the erosion was such that over $100,000 was spent just to revegetate this one 4 or 5 acre spot in the timber sale that had just eroded to where there was no topsoil left. And there were plenty of other areas in this timber sale that still really have not been fixed. They're just still kind of a mess. Lots of eroding happening from logging on concave topography and very steep slopes like this. The land between the lakes is a third forest that has been doing major level supposed restoration logging. In this case, it's sort of like Brawley in that the goal was that they've modeled that a lot of land between the lakes was historically kind of like an oak woodland or something, or nearly like a open savanna with grasses and a patchwork of trees. And 8,600 acres have been handed over the last 15 years to do this. And so what the locals have called the 8,600 has just been just not successful. And you can go up and down the major trace road, the LBL, and see this. It's just really bad, and you don't see grassy forbs, and you see a lot of sick and dying trees. And the locals have really gotten tired of this, and they are tired of restoration logging, and to the point where hundreds of cars did a caravan to protest this several years back, and it pretty much got the attention of Senators Paul and McConnell, and that who encouraged the forest to do a moratorium on logging actually turning close to 5 years. So the results are really starting to become profound enough to where locals have in some of these forests are really starting to speak up against this and saying the agency needs to rethink some of the implications of the restoration agenda. We've seen places where we have really misplaced restoration, so-called restoration priorities, to where it's just silly, like this timber sale over in the north end of the land between the lakes on the Kentucky side. So on the left is where they're starting to log out a really nice 140-year-old hardwood stand to promote oak regeneration. And on the right, some non-native loblolly pine plantation was probably planted by TVA in the 50s or the 60s, go untouched. I will say is that the agency has sort of, upon request by local conservationists, rethought this kind of policy. So hopefully that's going to start changing soon, and it appears to be. Then you have places like, say, the DeSoto down in Mississippi. You're getting down in that Gulf coastal plain where we have that historic longleaf pine ecosystem that has disappeared, and instead of promoting the remaining loblolly stands, I think this was like 16 17 years ago, they had a timber sale along the Black Creek National Scenic River and Trail where they logged some longleaf stands to supposedly restore longleaf. So once again, some of these so-called restoration priorities can seem misplaced. The Daniel Boone National Forest, in particular in the east, has really been suffering from misguided regeneration and restoration policies, with just tremendous amounts of erosion all over this forest. Like here's a 25-year-old shelterwood cut where a few trees were left that were going to make sure that oaks regenerate, because somehow they can't regenerate themselves. And they come out looking like this, where it's just this crowded bunch of poplars and maples, and as we see so many other places. And unfortunately, some of this restoration is taking just a tremendous toll. Here's some drone footage of a 2017 forest restoration project where mudsliding is taking place. Just absolutely terrible. And this alone should give the agency pause and really maybe reevaluate what is happening on the land region-wide in these projects. It's very unfortunate that this stuff has to keep going on, and we definitely need some reform of this. So what can we do for possible reform before we move on to our last R, which is resiliency? So one thing is that the influence of the timber sale program on fire ecology and fire management needs to be rethought. We need to stop tying to the hip fire ecology and forest ecology and the idea of restoration with timber targets. That this will help create a more, a more unbiased type of science. The agency also needs to undertake a comprehensive analysis of its large scale failures. And with these examples have accumulated to the point to where we could call them systemic. And the sample size of these has really reached a significant point where, as part of its monitoring and research mission, the agency really needs to look in this. And quite frankly, Congress needs to be budgeting the agency better in monitoring and evaluation and research. Um, and we also really think that maybe some of the various groups who have been supporting this stuff for over 20 years might want to use and are very influential with the agency and with elected officials to maybe take a look at this systemic problem and rethink their support and use their influence to maybe help the agency maybe reform some of this. And also a sense of scale. If restoration really is a sincere goal with the agency, and I'm sure that we've talked to some rangers and biologists who do have some legitimate stuff they would like to do, but they are constrained due to the timber mission, and also to the sense of scale. They're budgeted for huge burning projects, huge logging projects. So perhaps if there are some forests where a certain type of forest community really has almost disappeared, or an open woodland, or maybe a small prairie remnant where it historically existed, a more targeted, smaller projects where they can stay on top of it might be a little more manageable. So also, sometimes we can look at natural processes, and if we have a longer time horizon than 5 years or 10 years, we can see that natural processes, or some very modest attempts to mimic them, such as controlled burning, if we let those things take place, they can help guide, along with things like wind throws, tornadoes, insect infestations, in promoting those canopy opening, driving forces that help shape these forests without having to blast a bunch of roads and do a bunch of hauling logging trucks. And the commitment to research, as we've been saying, the agency really needs to get more budgeting for its research mission. It is a part of their mission, and they are woefully underfunded. And what we may claim is really the key takeaway of everything in this presentation is maybe for all of us to show a little bit of humility in accepting that our lives are very short compared to the always evolving dynamics of forest over time. Forests will diversify if we give them time. We're looking at a blip in time that was very unnatural, created by cleared out land and erosion. And these forests are trying to come back. And a lot of these places, maybe not every 1 acre of it, but a lot of these places will diversify on their own. They will start opening up after about 100 to 110 years old and start diversifying and start promoting forbs and more in microhabitats that we all know and love. But we have to let natural processes be a manager. If you want to see examples of this, go to some of our remnant old growth forests in the region, like the Pioneer Mother, or the Kilmer, Lily Cornet. There's so many places out there. They may not be huge acreage left, but they should be treasured and they should be researched. Old growth forests, it goes without saying, are so important because not only do they promote maximum biodiversity, we're learning that they increase carbon sequestration. We're learning that a lot of the carbon sequestration of forests are in the ground, in the root structure, in the mycorrhizal networks that old growth forests maximize. And that old growth forests just aren't trees. They are performing so many symbiotic relationships and microhabitats that include deadfall and coarse woody debris. That we need to realize that old growth forests give us that complex web of ecological associations that we wish that everybody would appreciate more. So the last R is going to be really quick because it's kind of new, relatively new. And this is called forest resiliency. So what is this? So resiliency is the idea that forests, have these complex network of ecological functions that make them resilient to stressors, whether they're human caused or natural. And as we contend, old growth forests do this magnificently. The agency has been taking the idea of resiliency and applying it to its fairly recent acknowledgement of possible climate changes and climate shifts, which can be strong stressors on the resilient and test the resiliency of these forests. So unfortunately, they're now yet another buzzword to justify more logging. But just as importantly, they are turning into the use of resiliency is increasingly being applied to shut the public out of participation on its public lands. National forests are quite different from national parks or national recreation areas, in that the public has very strong rights to participate and petition the government when they feel that our lands are not being managed properly or according to law. Unfortunately, some of the new regulations of changes to the National Environmental Policy Act are such that there are things called categorical exclusions, which basically can exclude the public from any meaningful transparency of the nature of the project beyond maybe a small announcement, or having that right to comment during a public comment period, and eventually even sue if they feel that important environmental laws are being compromised. And that these categorical exclusions are being triggered by restoration and resiliency language. That if a project is under, say, 2,800 acres and it has restoration and resiliency as a goal, the agency doesn't really have to involve the public like it does traditionally on timber sales or forest projects. So this is something that puts a whole new spin on the 3 Rs, that it goes beyond the forest ecology to forest policy and the public's involvement in it. This is fairly new, of course, and so we're monitoring the situation on how these new regulations that you invoke resiliency and restoration as kind of these emergency justifications to shut people out. One project is the Foothills Project in Chattahoochee. This is very much a thing in progress right now, and it's probably, and this could be changing fairly soon. But this is a huge omnibus kind of project, involves tens of thousands of acres, that using some of the new ideas and legal structures in the Forest Service, the agency wants to have some big meta announcement and an analysis, and you kind of get to participate early on, and then that's it. And then once the ink is signed, then when it comes down to when it spins off smaller projects of 5,000 or 10,000 acres or 2,000 or what have you, well, that was all covered in the analysis, and that no further public participation or transparency will happen if the ranger feels that is not necessary or advisable. We're seeing in other forests that similar rationales are happening. Like I said, it's fairly early in these types of new legal structures, so the agency's kind of feeling its way, and we're just kind of monitoring the situation right now in places like the Daniel Boone and the George Washington National Forest. So, in conclusion, the three R's are examples of how legitimate ecological concepts can be applied in a way that, whether intentional or not, can have very troubling results on the ground. And as we're learning with recent changes in environmental law, can actually shut out the public, and so it's time for the public and for Congress and the agency to really rethink this post-Healthy Forest Restoration Act landscape, what these terms mean, and what is actually happening when these terms get invoked. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. And I also want to give out special thanks to the many organizations that are listed here, and then individual activists who've contributed to this, which is yet another example of why the public needs to be included, because often it is people on the ground, regular folks who live right there around that forest, who are able to get the pulse of what's happening on the land and help promote better stewardship of the people's national forests.